Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This is PA Books, featuring authors of books about Pennsylvania and its people. This week, Jeffry Wert discusses his book, Gettysburg, Day 3, the story of the decisive day of the decisive battle of the Civil War.
Jeffry Wert, author of Gettysburg, Day 3. You remember the first time you went to Gettysburg?
Well, the first time I went to Gettysburg, it was part of, the, I think, traditional high school 8th grade field trip. And so I would have been about 13 or 14 years old when I went down. It's the first time I'd ever been to Gettysburg. I'd been a Civil War nut probably for about 4 years prior to that. I was about 10 years old when I first started getting interested in the Civil War.
Was that around the time of the centennial?
No, actually what it was, in my small town where I grew up at Reaversburg in Center County, I had a teacher who had been teaching for many years, and as a young man, he had sat around on Saturday nights and listened to the veterans tell their stories. And, 50 years later, he told us the stories. And that just got me. And then I was able to walk outside from our school, cross the road, and there was a town cemetery, and I used to walk by and look at some of the graves of the soldiers and stuff like that, and I became hooked.
What do you remember about that visit?
I don't remember much. I just remember that I was in awe of the place. You go from bus to bus and, one stop to the next. I just knew that I always wanted to come back to Gettysburg again when I was older, of course. At that time, I had no idea that I would be a Civil War historian. I just thought it would be a lifelong passion, certainly, to read about the war and visit Gettysburg as often as I could.
How often do you go now?
Oh, I try to get down as often as I can convince my wife to make the trip or something like that. I would imagine probably half a dozen or more times. When I was doing this book, I was entirely different. I was down there during the summer particularly. I might have been down once a week doing research and then walking the ground.
You mean half a dozen times a year you go?
Yes, probably.
Why do you go that often?
Because I just like to be there. I just like to walk the ground. And the other thing is there's always something new to see that I haven't seen before. I remember several years ago, I went down for a conference in Gettysburg, and it was in February, and we had no snow that winter, and it was strange to me how the terrain looked different. The undulations in the ground that you never see because of the crops in the fields and things like that. And it just struck me that, those would have been places where a soldier in an attack might have been able to find shelter or something from the fire, and things like that. But I'm not one of those necessarily that thinks that well, it is a special place. I should put it that way. There's a sense of that place about it that I guess it's just because you're such a, I think it is one of the most hallowed grounds in America, and it's also probably one of the most hallowed grounds in the world. And I just like going back to it. Even if I'm only there, even if we're bypassing Gettysburg, I'll probably come back and stop in town or, just stop somewhere at the high water mark or just do that for a few minutes and then keep going through.
Do you have a favorite spot at Gettysburg?
I'm not sure. By far and away, my favorite monument's the North Carolina Monument. Was done by Borglum. I think it's a great work of art. I always like to try to go over there, but I don't really think so. I do like to go to the wheat field as often as I can because the men from my hometown, that's where they fought at Gettysburg, in the wheat field. So,
for someone who's never been to Gettysburg, if they're going and thinking about going, how should they visit it?
Well, I do think if they're going to Gettysburg and they've never been there, you have to go to the National Park headquarters. And you can get your own kind of tour map, and the guides are excellent. The guides have to pass a very difficult test. Be honest about it, I'm not sure without cramming up in a lot of small details for all 3 days that I would even pass that test. They're very knowledgeable. There's also auto tours. I haven't taken any, but I've talked to people who have taken them, and they're very good. but I think your visit has to start at the park headquarters.
Now, your book is about Day 3 specifically. Why did you decide to write about Day 3?
Well, a number of reasons. One, a very fine Civil War historian, used to be the chief historian there, Harry Fons, had written about Day 2, and I knew that he was writing about Day 1. And nobody had written about the entire third day's battle on Day 3. The focus had always been on Pickett's charge, but somebody would include the fighting in Culp's Hill or the cavalry actions. I've done, some of my previous books had some of that action in it, but nobody had taken the Day 3, if you will, from the 24 hours. And I've always wanted to write in Gettysburg something. And secondly, I'm an historian. I think I'm probably a narrative historian as much as that, and it's a great story. And I tend to be drawn to subjects that are great stories, but it's a combination. I think if you're a Pennsylvanian, it's probably our battle, that idea. And but since nobody had done the third day in its entirety, I decided that's what I wanted to do.
Is Gettysburg as important as people perceive it? I mean, the battle or Pickett's charge? Do you see it as the turning point in American history, like some historians have said?
Yeah, I do. I mean, in combination with Vicksburg. And the reason for that is I view the Civil War in the sense of the military aspects. I think probably the Confederacy lost the war in the Western theater, but I think they only could have won the war in the Eastern theater because the Confederacy could not win a military war. It was one of those situations. What they had to do is achieve enough military victories that they could get a political settlement to the war. So Lee comes north looking for that as they say, the high tide. But he had what he had done in a year with the Army of Northern Virginia was remarkable. The only setback was Antietam, and if he came north after Fredericksburg in December '62 and Chancellorsville as recent as May of '63, and achieved a battlefield victory, it's not only the fact that he's in Northern Territory, just a little bit further, he's in actually free soil territory. He had made it to Maryland, a slave state in '62, but this is Pennsylvania. This is, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the enormous implications of a major victory on Northern soil. And so by not achieving that, by not being able to achieve that, Lee really, and the terrible fighting of the battle and the costliness of the battle, probably denied Lee the opportunity ever again to do that. And that's why I think it is the turning point. As far as Pickett's charge or the fighting on third days, I think it was settled as far as who was going to win. I think you can understand why Lee did what he tried to do. I mean, you have to try to do that as an historian, but I'm convinced because of the other side, the Union side, and what Meade and his subordinates did, the charge probably never had a chance. So it's very climactic, and it also adds this aura of decisiveness to the battle, and it is, I think, certainly the most famous infantry charge in American history, and if you've been there, and it's also in this like amphitheater. And that's the other thing you find out, that so many men who did not participate in it were able to witness this magnificent charge, if you will. I mean, as some other historians said, there's this terrible magnificence to war, and there would have been that certainly in this charge. I mean, there's this sublime beauty to it, if you will. I mean, we still like a parade, and you're looking at a great parade, and then until the cannons open and the rifle starts firing, and then that's a different story entirely.
You quote quite a few eyewitnesses as saying how beautiful the charge was when it started.
Yes, I do. I wanted to be particular in this book. One of my previous books I'd written on common soldiers, and increasingly as an historian you have great admiration for them. And the other thing that's wonderful about Civil War letters and diaries, like for instance on like Second World War, they're uncensored. So if you want to find out that a general wasn't particularly liked, you're going to hear it in some words you probably can't repeat, that they're not going to particularly like them. And so I thought that I wanted to try to keep it as near as I can contemporary, and their immediate reactions either in a diary or a letter within a few weeks of the battle, and get a sense of the day to them, as near as you can do that. I mean, I know history is artificial, and you have to create it, but as near as you can. And yes, I try to, what was it like for the men there who saw it, and also for the men who were in it, and to be honest about many ways what they have to say, they say it better than I would anyhow, and so I quoted them a good deal.
When you want to write a book about the Civil War and you want to find letters and diaries, where do you go to find them?
Well, surprisingly, one of the very best places, if not the best place in the country, is not far from here. It's at Carlisle Barracks at the United States Army Military History Institute. If you're going to write military history of the Civil War, and now increasingly I think the other wars, because they're increasing their holdings a great deal, you have to go to Carlisle. They have, well, I think alone they have 40,000 photographs, but I don't know how many manuscripts they specifically had. I know that myself and my wife, and she helps me in research, I think we went through at least 400 boxes of manuscript materials just at Carlisle. And then the other thing is the Park Library, Gettysburg. And then also you have great institutions like University of North Carolina, Historical Society of Pennsylvania, Virginia Historical Society. Over the years, they've amassed this great body. And the surprising thing is we're continuing to find new stuff that people come forth and said, oh, this is my great-great-grandfather's. Would you like to have it, or do you want to make copies of it? And we'll share with researchers. So it's there.
So when you go to a place like the Carlisle Barracks, you're allowed to touch the letters?
Generally, it varies. Increasingly, they would try to have them copied. One of the problems are a lot of soldiers' diaries are very small, and I've held both the real diaries and I've held copies. I've held real letters of individuals, and I've held diaries. Only as an aside, I will never forget it. I was doing my first book, and I went to Carlisle, and I was holding a letter of a staff officer to George Crook. And what it was the surrender of Mangus, Colorado, the Apache warrior. And it was there, and then right there it said, this is the X of Mangus. And, you realize, in the desert of Arizona, there's this great proud Apache warrior forced to make an X, and I'm holding the same document that he had to. So I like that a great deal. And but generally you'll find more and more as they have time and the money to do it, they copy, because the sweat and so forth in your hands are not very good for those.
I want to ask you about one or two letters from one person in particular that are toward the end of the book. Captain John Blinn of the 20th Massachusetts says he had suffered mortal wound on July 3rd, and with a brief time left, he penned two letters home, one to his wife and one to his mother, and you quote from the letters. How did those two letters, which were sent to two different places, happen to get into your hands?
I'd have to remember where they came from. I think they're from the Massachusetts Historical Society, which I probably got copies of at Gettysburg, at the library at Gettysburg. The park over the years have sent historians out, and they'll go to, I know in fact they told me that some of the material that they have there from the Massachusetts Historical Society has never been used by historians because it was only recently acquired by them as far as copies. But that's how I would have gotten them. And when I saw them immediately, that's the kind of, if you will, pathos, human interest that I enjoy so much. I mean, it's I thought one of the great love letters I've ever read, where, as he's dying, he tells his wife to, mourn for me, yes, but go find another love and live your life, because I've died for my country, as I, volunteered to do if necessary.
When you're going through boxes after box, does it get tedious? I mean, do you spend whole days where you just get nothing?
You do, and it gets tedious. And I work from note cards, so I'm not a computer person. In fact, I not only work from note cards, I write longhand. My wife does all my computer work. She's the first person to look at my manuscript, and it does. But one of the things I've always liked about being an historian is I like to learn new things. And you find that letter, or you find this account that very few people have seen before, or it's something important. And it does get to be tedious work, and it's hard work. Though researching is actually more pleasant, I think, than the actual writing, because that's when, you know, the truth is there's that blank page, and you have to fill it in with something that's worth reading. But it is, but if I have to have my choice, I could probably research far more than I could sit at a desk and write.
Now, there are a lot of Civil War buffs in America and a lot of very knowledgeable people about the Civil War. When you sit down to write a book like this, what level do you decide to write it at? I mean, what level of knowledge do you assume in the reader when you write it? Can someone read this if they know nothing about the Civil War?
They can. Part of it, when I first started to write with Simon & Schuster and got to an editor, who I'm still with, he would remind me that, you know, not all these people out there are the Civil War buffs, the ones who know a great deal about what you're talking about. So I try to, and you'll see in this book, I try to set backgrounds, I try to set scenes. I mean, I reintroduced Robert E. Lee. Now, I imagine the real Civil War buffs, well, I know how old Lee is. I know he graduated from West Point, those kind of things, what he looked like physically. But I do try to reach a broader audience. I try to reach more than just the Civil War buffs, because I think general history students of history would like that. But when it comes down to it, I guess it's a book, obviously, of such detail that these Civil War buffs demand. And as a Civil War historian, they're your first audience. And they're the toughest audience probably in the country to write for, because of the level of knowledge. I mean, and then if you take on Gettysburg, this book, in the sense of when you start to write it and you realize what you're doing, I was scared in the sense that, boy, oh boy, am I taking on ground that is, to some people, sacred, in the sense of this is the third day and, you know, you're going to do this, and you sure you know what this is? Because there's people out there, well, I know exactly what the 20th Massachusetts did, and you don't quite have that right. And they probably do know far more exactly about the 20th Massachusetts than I might as an historian looking at the broader day, you know. So, but they're a wonderful audience, but they are a tough audience.
Well, there are also so many books about the Civil War and so many books about Gettysburg. How do you come up with something that brings new information to the table?
Well, that was one of the questions I had to ask myself. If I'm going to write another book in the day third, but again, I said, surprising, there's been no modern treatment of the entire day. And what I then decided to do was to just do the research, to find more and more, as much as I can. I think there's like 475 manuscript collections in this book, and another 300 and some, you know, published sources I've used. And I think in the detail and some of the incidents that are there, and also what is very important in this book is to try to frame both the Confederate High Command and the Northern High Command, and what the decision-making was, and try to resolve that. So my goal, partially, and you're right, I mean, there's so much written on it, and many of them esoterically, is nevertheless to come down and try to give it an overall treatment that might not have been accorded it before. I like to say when I go out and speak that if you're going to write military history, particularly in the East, you must understand that the Confederacy has won the military history of the war. They have framed the war. The framing of the military history of the war was done in the post-war decades.
You're saying the Confederacy has won
the military history.
Post,
you know, in the sense of Robert E. Lee, I think rightly so, is an American hero. But if you just ask a person on the street, well, what about Robert E. Lee and Grant? Well, if they have a little knowledge, you'll say, well, Lee was a great general and Grant was a butcher. Well, that means that Lee is, in the context of time, have won it. And you look at Gettysburg, most of the accounts of Gettysburg tend to be framed from the Confederate side. Now, in the sense that's justifiable, because Lee made that battle, in the sense it was his decisions, because he had the initiative that the Union reacted to his decisions. But one of the things I really wanted to do in this book was to give a full treatment as I can to the Federal Army on the third day, as you would in the Confederate Army.
What is interesting, you have pictures of a lot of the key generals on both sides in here, and the Confederate generals are much more household names than the Union generals.
Yeah, that's another example.
You get down one or two
right.
commonly known names on the Union side, and then they're more obscure.
Right. Grant, Sherman, of course, people love to quote Sherman in war, and maybe Phil Sheridan to people, George Custer. I'll just give you an example. Years ago, I used to teach an evening course at Penn State, and I got to the Civil War, and we were discussing it, and I said, okay, who's the Confederate General Gettysburg, commander of the Army? Robert E. Lee, all knew it. All right, who commanded the Union Army? Nobody knew it. A native Pennsylvanian, George G. Meade, but nobody, you know, and that's partially Meade's fault. He banned newspaper correspondence from headquarters, so they just ignored him. So he's lost somewhat to history.
Well, let's talk about some of the generals.
Oh, sure.
Talk about General Meade.
Well, I think the case, he took command on the morning of June 28th. Joseph Hooker, the loser at Chancellorsville, finally the exasperation he claimed, he resigned, and immediately Lincoln accepted his resignation. And Meade wrote later, or at least I quote his son in a letter, Meade was awakened in Frederick, Maryland at 3 a.m. in the morning, and he thought he was going to be arrested. And instead he's handed command of the Army of Potomac. I think you can make a fairly good argument that no commander of an American army, major American army, and the Army of the Potomac was the major American army, Union Army in the war because of the political ramifications of what would happen with the defeat of that. And Meade acted very cautiously by nature as an engineer, and the battle suited Meade. He was irascible as the days long. One of his nicknames was the old snapping turtle. He had a temper, he just flared up. But what he did, I think, at Gettysburg is he reverted back to what he'd been as a Corps commander, in the sense that he turned to his colleagues who he'd just been, as a Corps commander 5 days earlier, said, okay, what do you think? What can we do? And he handled that army very well, given the circumstances that he was in. And it's one of the great performances in the Civil War, really. Now, people say, well, no, the true great performances is fighting an offensive battle like Lee did at Chancellorsville. I agree with that. But the circumstances in which Meade found himself, 3 days before the first clash of arms, and then what he did, it ranks right up there.
What happened to Meade after the Battle of Gettysburg?
He stayed on as commander. Well, Lincoln never, I think, quite forgave him for allowing Lee to escape. But Lincoln didn't understand it. I mean, there's a very famous quote that Lincoln wrote, if we could have reached out and grabbed Lee before he crossed the Potomac. Well, Lincoln's sitting in Washington. Meade's on the field. And I know from previous work I've done, if you read the accounts of Union soldiers, once they were able to look at the Confederate lines at field works that Lee's army had erected around Williamsport, Maryland, they all thanked George Meade for not attacking those works. And another thing that people might find surprising was thousands of Federal soldiers in Meade's army were barefoot. We always think of the Confederates as barefoot and all that. There was thousands of them because they were forced to make forced marches, if you will, from Virginia to catch up with Lee's army. And so they're not the best condition, besides the enormous casualties. But he stays on as commander. And then Grant comes in, and when Grant comes in March of '64, Grant decides that he's not staying in Washington. He does not want to be near the politicians, and he wants to go and be with the Army. So Grant really runs the Army from the spring of '64, though Meade is the last commander of the Army of Potomac. But as I said, he got angry at newspaper correspondents, so he essentially banished them. And they decide, okay, George, we won't write about you. And George Meade got lost to history.
Hey, you refer to the Army of the Potomac and Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. How was the overall military divided up there? How many armies were there on the Union side and the Confederate side?
Oh, there was two very important Confederate armies. There was the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of Tennessee. The Army of Tennessee was the army in the West. There would have been the Army of Mississippi. Was the one army that surrendered to Grant at Vicksburg. So there are some other major armies. Sherman, for instance, in his Atlanta campaign, commanded 3 armies. The Army of the Tennessee, meaning the river, the Army of the Cumberland, and the Army of the Ohio. But so if you think of Sherman's army, there are actually 3. Lee's army, clearly, and the other thing that happened, too, with Lee's army in Northern Virginia, by the summer of '63, they were the cause. for the Confederacy. Lee himself and his army embodied it because they were the best hope for the Confederacy to achieve independence. There were other Union armies, in the southwestern part of the country, southwestern meaning in Louisiana, when they operated down there. There was a Confederate army across the Mississippi, Army Trans-Mississippi, and so forth. But the two major armies would have been in the Tennessee, Kentucky, and then Georgia areas, and then Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania for the one.
So when Grant was put in charge, was he put in charge of the entire military or just the Army of?
No, he was put. Congress did is they reinstated the rank given to Washington, and Grant became General in Chief of all armies and the Navy. Grant was the Union commander of all the military forces of the Union during the last year of the war.
And you said that Meade was the head of the Army of the Potomac through the war?
Right.
The war?
From June '63 until Appomattox in April '65. So what happened, of course, it was very difficult. When Grant came east and he decided to be with the headquarters of the Army of the Potomac, you have that layer of command. So when Grant wanted to get something through, it was to go through Meade. And that works not very well for about 4 or 5 weeks. And then what you have is Grant and his staff basically taking over and being more directly in charge of the Army. And Meade wasn't shelved. I don't mean that. Meade was with the Army the whole time. And they operated through the channels as much as they could. But the decision to cross the James River, for example, and besiege Petersburg was Grant. Creating an army in the Shenandoah Valley in '64 was Grant. Those kind of things. And so Meade reverted to, I guess in today's parlance, would probably be the chief of staff to the ranking general.
I want to talk a little bit about the strategy of the battle, but first a little bit about you, if we could. First of all, you're a Center County native?
Yes. In fact, I grew up in Reeversburg. I live about 15 miles west of the Reeversburg at Center Hall today. My wife's from Center County. Both our children still live in Center County, and I have been teaching school at Pennsylvania High School, which happened to be my alma mater. It was circumstances, but I ended up coming back to my high school and teaching. This is my 33rd year of teaching.
Where'd you go to college?
I went to Lock Haven University, Lock Haven State College at the time. Very pleased with it. I was a liberal arts major, and I think I learned to write there. I had professors that say, paragraphs have to go together, and I thought, well, really? And I try to keep a narrative flow. And then I have a master's degree from Penn State in history.
Did you know you wanted to be a historian all along?
No, actually, I'd gone to Lock Haven initially I was in pre-law, and I had a wonderful professor in the Civil War, and I decided that I wanted to teach. I actually wanted to teach in college, and I'd planning to go to graduate school. I'd been accepted at the University of Virginia to do graduate studies, and then this is the Vietnam era. I graduated from college in '68. I lost my deferment, so I couldn't go, and actually I wasn't certified to teach, and I ended up selling insurance for a year, and I was particularly poor at that, and just by luck and circumstances, I was back at my old high school, and I was offered a job. Actually, I taught 6th grade for 3 years. I was an elementary teacher. Those days they really needed teachers because it was a baby boom and all that, and then after 3 years of that, I transferred to the high school. I got certified in both elementary and secondary ed, and I've been at the high school ever since.
You like teaching high school?
Oh, yes, I do. I've never regretted not teaching college. And also I teach we're the small school in Center County. We only have like 770 students in grades 7 through 12. It's a very relaxed atmosphere. It's a very, very good place to teach. It always has been, primarily because of the students. As a whole, they're very good kids. And I teach mostly college prep students. I teach an advanced placement course in United States history and an honors course to seniors and a local history course. And now this year I'm going to teach a course in military history, which I hadn't done for a while. But it's a very, very good place to teach. And I am biased, I guess. I keep trying to say that I'm not. I grew up there, but you know the people. and they have a commitment. Well, we're within Center County, and there's Penn State looming, and many people work there. But there's always been a commitment to trying to get the best education for your child, and it's a very good place to work.
How many books have you written, counting this one?
This is my 6th book.
Can you give me the titles?
My first book was called From Winchester to Cedar Creek, the 1864 Shenandoah Valley Campaign, which was published in '87. Then I wrote a book on the Gray Ghost called Mosby's Rangers. And I followed that with a biography of General James Longstreet, who's prominent in this book, of course. And then my next book was Custer, The Controversial Life of George Armstrong Custer. And then 3 years ago, I came out with a book I really enjoyed called A Brotherhood of Valor. It was a narrative history of the Confederate Stonewall Brigade and the Union Iron Brigade, and I took them through the war together. Saw what was happening to these 2 units, top flight elite units, and what happens to them is a war. The war destroys good soldiers, good troops when you're asked to do so much. And then this is my, though this, and actually, to be honest about it, I wanted to do this for several years. I just finally had to convince my agent to allow me, and then he agreed, and the editor took the book. And but that, and I wanted to do that before I did Custer. But so this has been, brimming in me, I guess, for a long time.
Which of your books has sold the best?
So far, this book, Out the Door, has sold the best. It's in the 3rd printing. It's, if I may say, it's been nominated for a National Book Award and a Pulitzer. And but my book that sold the most, hands down, has been my book on James Longstreet. Though this book, Out the Door, sold better than Longstreet did. Longstreet apparently hit a chord. It was before the monument that's now down at Gettysburg battlefield and so forth. So,
do your students are they aware of the fact that you write these books that sell so well?
Yes, they are. They generally ask me how much money I'm making, but they are. And what I found out, I think, with this, and they're teenagers, and somebody once said to me, "You don't take yourself very seriously." I said, "I teach teenagers. If you took yourself so seriously, they'd cut you off at the knees, And they were very refreshing. What I found out, I demand a lot of writing from my students. And I think what what I do on the side has helped me when I say to them, this isn't very good. And they don't necessarily say, well, how do you know it's not very good? And, and I can always say, well, I'm writing or something right now, and I know it's not very good. And in that sense, they'll ask me certain things about it. I know what I am also as a teacher is a wealth of stories, as you can see from this book and others. And students like stories. And see, to me, I take my class every year, my seniors every year to Gettysburg. And we talk about tactics and how the battle was played out and how they did that. But what I try to do constantly is these little stories, because that's their link. We're not going to refight Gettysburg tactically, but there are common human elements of those people who were Gettysburg, from the civilians who were in town to the soldiers there. That's our link to them. That's our shared commonality, our humanity. And so when I tell these human interest stories, I try to show them that, I keep telling them it's far more fascinating than fiction. I also tell them that the one subject you will walk out the door with as a companion is history. And they look at you askance. I said, no, history is always part of you. When you first vote, you're going to vote for a candidate based upon previous people who have held the office or something, like the president. You're going to make a judgment on who was the best kind of president we had, and you're going to vote for somebody you think is close to that or you like or suits that. And that's the kind of thing. And to me, I hope I make my best students read a book and do a review of a book, a critique of it. And I hope maybe when they leave my classes and years from now, they'll read a book and they'll remember the class. And I hope they vote. I even tell them, the other thing I want you to do, if some of you can, is run for office in towns. Be in a borough council where they don't pay any money. Give something back to the country. And if you can show them valor, but I also show them cowardice. I mean, that's a human chronicle. I mean, some people failed tests. Other people went far and beyond the call of duty. And, you know, the world we're living in right now, we can see that, you know, manyfold. So,
You mentioned this gentleman who you wrote a biography of, General Longstreet. What can you tell me about him and his performance at Gettysburg in particular?
it's his performance and his relationship at Gettysburg, arguably in Civil War history, is maybe the most controversial thing. Again, it goes back, certainly in Confederate history. Longstreet was Lee's senior corps commander. In fact, well, Stonewall Jackson had been mortally wounded at Chancellorsville 2 months earlier and died on May 10th. Longstreet actually outranked Jackson. He was promoted a day ahead of Jackson in October '62 by Lee. Longstreet believed that the problem for the Confederates was the fact that in the spring of '63 they were running out of manpower. Now, he agreed with Lee that they had to take the war north and they had to do these things. But once they got to the battlefield, and it began in the late afternoon of July 1st, Longstreet came onto the field and he surveyed the ground. They were in Seminary Ridge, probably near the seminary today. We're quite certain about that. And he scanned the ground across as well as he could. It was much more open, and you could see Cemetery Hill. If you look closely, you could see the ridge down there in Culp's Hill. And he told Lee that we have them where we want them. We've just won a great victory in a sense. Now we can move by our flank and position ourselves between them and Baltimore or Washington and make them attack us. Lee said, no, we're not doing that. And to be honest about Longstreet's plan wasn't a very good idea. Lee didn't have the cavalry there to screen it. He didn't even know where 5 of the 7 Union Corps were. But that starts it. And then Longstreet will object to, on July 2nd, to Lee resuming the offensive again. He reiterates this. And then on July 3rd, he is, you know, in words basically paraphrased, once Lee tells him what he's going to do with becomes Pickett's charge, or Longstreet's assault probably is more accurate, Longstreet tells him that no 15,000 men can take that position, General. But Lee says he believes they can, and the details have been left to Longstreet. Now, what happens to Longstreet is really post-war, in a sense, is his best friend before the war was Ulysses S. Grant. In fact, Grant marries a cousin of Longstreet's. So when Grant became president, Longstreet was in the business in New Orleans, but like many Confederates and many Southerners, the economic conditions in the South were terrible. Grant offers him a job. By doing that, he has to turn to Republican, and that was the thing. You were a pariah in the South to do that.
Is that when he became controversial
as
a general?
After the war.
After the fact? And
then once Lee died in '70, very shortly afterwards, some of Lee's other officers, not notable officers, certainly his artillery commander, William Pendleton, who was, I would hope, a better minister than he was a general, because he certainly was a very good general. He goes ahead and says that Longstreet, for example, was ordered to attack at sunrise on July 2nd. It's complete fabrication. And then one thing led to another. And then, of course, Longstreet was not a very able rider, and he started to defend himself. Well, you can't blame him, because Gettysburg became, you know, as Faulkner said in his one book, you know, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, July 3rd, Southern hopes are still there, and then, you know, with the repulse of Pickett's charge, Southern hopes are over. He's the one who becomes blamed for losing the battle that cost the Confederacy the war. So you would defend yourself. You would expect, but he didn't defend himself very well. And to be honest about it, the controversy raged for a century, really, until finally the '60s. One historian put to rest the Sunrise Order, which frankly never made sense. Lee would not attack an enemy who didn't know where he was without checking it. So, you know, but it's still there. It's Longstreet stirs controversy, stirs that. And his performance at Gettysburg, he had problems with it. I'd be the first to admit that. There are certain things he should have done, particularly in July 2nd. His instincts and his judgment was clearly right in July 3rd. But then, you know, as I deal with in the book, the unfortunate thing for Confederate command in the 3rd is the fact that we don't have these great documents. Lee didn't issue written orders as such. And so you can't trace that. And who was responsible? Well, Longstreet was responsible for the Assault and Reserve troops. And he sent 2 brigades in the reserve, but he stopped others from going forward. They were advancing, he stopped then. You know, we can't answer those questions definitively yet as an historian unless we come up with these documents that we don't know about. But he was a good soldier, bull of a man. But this is the controversy in Confederate history. This is the Lee Longstreet at Gettysburg is probably the single most important controversy to people.
Now, I want to show this map because this is actually the first map I've seen of Gettysburg that I was able to understand. And can you pull out a little bit and show the whole thing from top to bottom, Rob? And this, can you explain what we're looking at here? Now, these black dots along here are the Union armies, and the Confederate armies are kind of wrapped around them.
Exactly. That was one of the great virtues of the ground that the Army of Potomac would hold at Gettysburg. Yeah, you probably, well, I'm sure many of your viewers have heard that, and you probably, it's the fishhook line. It's a line that the barb is there at Culp's Hill, and it extends over to Cemetery Hill. Then the long shank of the fish hook goes down to Little Round Top.
So this is Culp's Hill around here,
right?
And it goes around to Little Round Top.
And it's a convergent line. So in other words, and that's what Meade does. In fact, he almost cost his army the battle. Late in July 2nd, he orders all the troops off Culp's Hill. And if he had done that, because the Confederates would launch an attack there, and one brigade was left behind to fought magnificently, it would have been as important. Culp's Hill was as important as Little Round Top. I think with the movie Gettysburg, everybody thinks it's just Little Round Top was a key, but actually Culp's Hill was too. Conversely, for Lee and the Confederates to move troops, you're moving it on the outer arc of it. So his line was like 5 miles long, where Meade could shift troops from one position to another. For example,
he could move back and forth in this area here where Lee had to move all the way around.
On the morning of July 3rd, Meade issued orders to his subordinates that essentially placed a reserve force of about 13,500 men from units that had been battered on the first and second days, but they were behind the lines in southern Cemetery Ridge and so forth, that they could move, and they were under orders to be prepared to move in case of a Confederate assault on any portion of the line. He could do that readily because of his position. That's why I think increasingly our military and other military, they were returning more and more to Gettysburg because it's a great place to study how terrain clearly can affect the outcome of a battle.
Did the Union win because they had better placement on the field?
Yes, as much as that. They were fighting a defensive battle. You're also looking at an army who had been humiliated, and you read their accounts, and I put numbers of them in there. When the battle's over, for example, they think this is redemption. The famous scene that they do in the movie Gettysburg, which was true, with the repulse of Pickett's charge, the Union soldiers up there are shouting Fredericksburg because they had to charge up a long slope at Fredericksburg in December of '62 and were slaughtered by the Confederates. The ground favored them. The interior lines favored them. All those factors. And then also I think they weren't left down finally by their commanders. And those things came together at Gettysburg. Besides, I think, the grit of the Union soldiers fighting in northern soil, we have to win this battle. And Confederate mistakes occurred. Whenever you're going to try to launch an offensive attack, you're going to have, we like, today we start moving these things around like they're chessmen, but we're talking humans here, and moving men around and so forth. And yet the Confederates came very close, for example, on July 2nd to breaking the Union line, but Meade had enough troops at hand that he could pull in. I remember one soldier wrote about it, the Confederate said, he said, "My God, do we have to fight the entire universe?" And it seemed that way to them as they're going forward and wrecking one federal command. Next thing you know, another federal brigade usually, or a regiment perhaps, is appearing. So the ground clearly favored Meade, clearly favored him.
Did they end up in that position deliberately, or was it kind of just by luck?
It just so happened, right. Well, July 1st, they were swept from north and west of Gettysburg through the town in the afternoon of July 1st. And when Oliver O. Howard, 11th Corps commander, came there, he was in charge. He was ranking commander because John Reynolds had been killed. And he posted brigade and cannon on Cemetery Hill, which you would. Any trained soldier would see you have to hold this hill right here. And the roads came there, so he held it. Meade, on the other hand, sent Winfield Scott Hancock, another Pennsylvanian, probably the best corps commander in the Army. He came and took command, and he agreed. And that's where they rallied late in the afternoon of July 1st. And from there, they would converge on the roads that would lead both armies to Gettysburg. And then late on the evening of July 1st, they occupied Culp's Hill. But Little Round Top was not occupied well until late in July 2nd. They started to extend the line down. But when Meade came, he asked the generals, "Is this good ground?" And they said, "Yes, it is good ground, and we should stand here." And they were trained. You know, these were veteran officers, and it was good ground to hold. And those set of circumstances, and that was one of the objections Longstreet had to it, because he was a trained soldier too, and he could see that ground, and we're going to have to dislodge them from ground that favored them. And usually when you do that, it's very costly and very bloody to do so.
I'll show this map one more time, just to make it clear that when Pickett's charge happened, it was along this part here. Is that right?
In the center of the line, yes, correct.
That part there.
Right.
Which is Cemetery Hill, or Cemetery Ridge. And the opposite side of the valley there is Seminary Ridge.
Right.
Okay. I just wanted to show that part because that's essentially the capstone of your book.
Yes.
Well, a couple of questions occurred to me while I was reading this, and they're not related to what we were talking about, but I have to ask them. Question number one is, can you talk about the artillery? Because that plays a key role in Pickett's charge, and what the cannons were like and what the shells were like? And how far could the cannons shoot?
Well, the Confederates had, for example, 2 cannons. They were British made. They're called Whitworth. If I understand it right, they could shoot 3 miles. But generally speaking, the rifled cannon that the Federals had more of, heavier 3-inch rifles, a cannon which you wanted, and they shot an elongated shell. The most standard cannon you'd have, and you see them today at Gettysburg particularly, they're the green ones, you know, from the weathering. They're called Napoleons. They were 12-pound howitzers. They were awful deadly in short range. I mean, they could fire 800 or so yards, but where they were particularly good because of the wide barrel and so forth was they would fire canister, which it could vary in size, but generally 1-inch slugs packed in sawdust, and you could pack anywhere from like 35 slugs to 49 slugs in a can or canister. Soldiers called it canned hailfire, and that's what faced Pickett's men at the end. But the artillery played a more critical role. One of the key flaws of Lee's plan, he pitted his worst arm, the artillery. And the reason it's the worst arm, not that they didn't have able artillerists and officers. In fact, Longstreet's artillery commander, E. Porter Alexander, probably had one of the great intellects in the whole Army. He was a very bright young man. But they had faulty ammunition. They didn't have the better cannon in the sense of the rifled cannon. And they're pitting it against what was clearly the best arm of the Federal Army, and that was their artillery. Also against a man who really, as much as anybody, the word is overused, and I might be overusing it, and that is genius. But Henry Hunt, the artillery commander, was probably a genius when it came to artillery. And Hunt believed once the morning hours progressed, this is an afternoon assault. So it builds up. Hunt became convinced that they were going to assault the Federal lines. He wasn't sure, but he was convinced. So he did all the preparations. And what Lee's plan was, essentially, broken down very simply, was he had to get the infantry, Pickett's and Pettigrew's men, nine brigades, across 1,400 yards of ground without suffering terrible losses or disorganization from the counterfire of Federal artillery. So to do that, Lee decided to have this mass cannonade unparalleled in the Army's history against their artillery. That was their target in the cannonade. Now, whatever collateral damage, use our words today, that you would do to the infantry was good, but the target was to silence or to disable as many Federal cannon as they could. And they succeed. I think they either because of some of the Federal cannon ran out of ammunition, or they were actually disabled. There were 34 cannons removed from the line. However, Henry Hunt, between the time the cannonade ends and the Confederate infantry comes forward in the span of, say, 15 to 20 minutes, Hunt replaced them with almost 12 batteries, which would have been almost 45 cannon. So every one that was lost, Hunt replaced. And then the Confederates just never had a chance coming across here. One of the great quotes I found in a book was, when I was doing research, was a member of the 14th Virginia. He was in Louis Armstead's brigade. And he writes that as they're, and in fact I titled the chapter, if you see the advance, as they're coming across and what they did, they had two kinds of fire on them. They'd fire these regular cannonballs that we think of, be a rolling fire where they hit the ground and try to just knock over men. The other thing was, of course, exploding shells.
How would they explode? What would cause them to explode?
Well, they had a fuse on them, and you would estimate the range, and then you would cut the fuse. And as they're fired, the fuse would ignite, and say at a range of, you estimate, 800 yards, you'd cut the fuse to that distance, and if it exploded, it would rain down shrapnel on them. See, that's where the Confederates had their problem. They had faulty fuses. They weren't very good. And so they're hit by both. They're hit by this rolling fire along the ground, and then they're hit by these shell fire, and men are dismembered. And I said, the one Confederate soldier said he remembered seeing body parts flying like feathers before the wind. It was that gruesome, and that's what they faced. And then when they got to the Emmitsburg Road, that's when the Union infantry came into play, and that's where the barrier, the fences were, that it stopped them, their momentum. They had to cross the fences, and then they became target for Federal infantry. And then the Union cannon switched to these 1-inch canister slugs. There's a count I have in there that and you marvel at the bravery, especially in both sides. But like Pickett's and Pettigrew's men, they knew crossing that road, their chances of, if you're going to continue up that slope, your chance of making it back are slim. And there's one where it's clearly documented on both sides that at one point the Confederates were closing on the low stone wall in front of the trees, and they saw the Confederate Union battery back there preparing to fire canister. They're veterans, and they were waiting for it, and all they did was just lean their head forward and bow like you go into a gale. But it's a gale of lead that, by one account, said when it was over with, there wasn't a Confederate standing in the range of where they fired the cannon at. And that's incredible, incredible bravery. To do such a thing, and to know full well what you're doing, and your response to it is to lean into like it's a rainstorm, you know.
When Pickett's, well, it wasn't just Pickett's army, but when the Confederate army marched across the field toward the Union army, why did they walk instead of running?
Well, you have to, first of all, you would have been exhausted, and then the attack would have been spent. So you're going to go to a common time where you're going to get across as fast as you can. It took them about, well, they were delayed at the Emmitsburg Road, but by the distance, it would have, if they would have just been marching at that time, it would have made it in about 18 to 19 minutes. And you want to be able to deliver a blow and to keep organized. That's the other thing. That's where, for example, the technology of war had overcome this. This is one of the last charges like this in the war. Now, there's some others similar later on, but not in this. One of the more famous ones is very late in the war at Franklin, Tennessee. But you're going to make this assault and get there so your men aren't winded, so they can go up the slope and deliver your volleys and break through, because the goal was to break through the line and then fan out, and then your reserves would pour through and you'd break the Union line.
At what point did the Confederates start shooting?
They didn't really start shooting until they got to, most of them until they got to the other side of the Emmitsburg Road. In that range of about 200, 250 yards. The Springfield or Enfield, many Confederates carried Enfield rifles, which were British made. They also carried many, many Springfield rifles, 58 caliber, that were Union made because they had captured so many in the early days of the war in 62 from the battlefields. So consequently, they were well armed too. They were a very good weapon for killing at 300 yards. They're extremely good inside of 100. But yet most soldiers, the estimate is, and nobody knows this for sure, but you hear writings where for every soldier killed in the Civil War in combat, they shot his weight in lead because they just missed him so often. And the other peculiar thing about it, the bullet actually rose. So men were told to shoot low because the bullet would rise up and go over. If you shot for their chest at 100 yards, the bullet would pass over their head. So they were taught to shoot low. And the other factor, too, that no television or no movie can really deal with because you wouldn't see it, is the volume of smoke. And if you remember from the book, there's accounts where officers are down on their knees or bending over, looking under this curtain of smoke, and they yelling for the men to shoot it. The first time you see legs, just shoot, because they couldn't see the full man because of just the black powder smoke.
We only have a couple minutes left, and there's two things I have to ask about. One is, how did they sleep, and how much sleep did they get? Because the battle was 3 days, and what did they eat, and when did they eat?
Well, they got very little sleep. I actually start my book very briefly with an account of an officer from Vermont, never been in a battlefield, and he was trying to get sleep on the night of July 2nd. He heard this noise he had never heard before, and it was a moaning of wounded men. It was like a rolling over the crest where he was. They slept on the ground. They got whatever shelter they could, if they had their knapsacks with them or blankets, and veterans were pretty well stripped down. They always had a pan, and they always had a coffee pot and a coffee cup. The Federal Army actually was hurting for food. It's just surprising. On the morning of July 2nd, the most important things of the Federals were food, where the Confederates, on the other hand, seemed to be pretty well. They had the wagons up and so forth. Pickett's division wasn't on the field until the morning of the 3rd. They had cooked breakfast, so they were fed. But that's what they did, yeah, and they just slept on the ground. Officers might find a barn or something or house, but at Gettysburg, by the night of July 2nd, every barn and house behind the lines was being used by surgeons for hospitals, so you would have slept on the ground.
There were people whose job was just to bring food in and cook it for the troops?
No, actually not necessarily cook it. Well, they ate, at that point they would have been having rations, and they would have been eating what's called hardtack. It's awful. It's on lead and flour. It was in like a 3-inch square, and it was just awful. What they tried to do, if they had a little bit of pork or something that they were issued, they would just cook it in the grease to give it flavor. But the supply trains had not caught up with the Army, and that's why they were having problems on the morning of the 3rd eating. And count after count, all they wanted to do was, well, I think one soldier said, we tightened our belt as far as we could, then we pulled it another notch. I mean, it was just, the thing that helped them, on the other hand, was tobacco. You're talking a pipe-smoking, cigar-smoking army, but primarily, so those who smoked pipes, that helped to ease the hunger pains and so forth. But some of the men had very little to eat until probably the morning of July 4th. And yet they did what they did.
Well, we only have about a minute left, but can you give about a 1-minute description of at the Gettysburg battlefield? There's a place called the East Cavalry Battlefield that seems like it's away from everything else and has nothing else to do with the battle. What happened there?
Well, that's where Jeb Stuart went around the flank of the Union Army. I believe there was no coordination. They say that, where Stuart was going to be in position when Pickett broke through. There's no evidence of that. But he was probably heading for 2 taverns at Baltimore Pike, getting the rear of Pickett's army. And Baltimore Pike's their main supply line. He is met there by David Gregg, Pennsylvanian. But the man who emerges in this field, of course, is George Armstrong Custer. This is his first battle as a brigade commander. He's dressed in a black velvet uniform. It was striking.
23-year-old general.
23-year-old general who ends up being the youngest major general in our history at 25. Why this is also, because of Gettysburg, this is one of the cavalry charges that you think of when you watch a Western movie or where they're on horseback, because most times cavalry actually fought dismounted. But you're right, very, very few people visited, and it's probably the most pristine area of the Gettysburg battlefield. I can go out there many times, and my wife and I go out and visit there, or walk around, and we're the only people there.
You have another book in the works?
Yes, I do. I started researching a book. It's on the Army of the Potomac. Yeah.
This is the cover of the book we've been talking about, Gettysburg Day 3. Jeffrey Wert, I wish we had more time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.